Chapter 8. Psychoanalysis. Looking back over my life, I realized that, after having worked in the ministry in my country and in the U.S. for more than 20 years, the Lord has taken me through various experiences to prepare me for the work He had set aside for me to do. What a school! What a training! Definitely, it was the Lord who spoke to me back in 1986 when He told me to forget the word easy. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for the good works whereunto He has called us into. Ephesians 2, verse 10. On the personal side, my growing understanding generated new questions in my mind. To better understand myself, introspection was needed. It was gradually dawning on me that my personal experience was unusual. With God's help, I began to take trips into my inner world. Some traits in my personality and external factors also were becoming clear to me. For example, it occurred to me that I was compassionate and caring. Nothing wrong with that. With good learning abilities, willingness, and readiness to develop them. I was self-motivated. I tended to be enthusiastic about the things I liked. I was also outgoing. Most people said I was good-looking and attractive, namely my lighter complexion and thick hair texture. Abu Esel attracted men in my community. Unfortunately, I was also physically weak and mentally unprepared. All it took at the time was a twist of my arm or a slap on my face to neutralize me. Naivete was pervasive. I tended to look only at the positive side of people and displayed readiness to trust people in general. Also, it was hard for me to scream when facing danger and call for help. I concluded this combination of naivete, stoicism, physical attractiveness, and physical weakness was the fateful mixture that had made me such an easy prey to the system. What to do? I asked myself. I was in emotional turmoil. There had to be a way to change this deadly combination. How did I learn to trust so easily, to be so naive? Why was sexual assault so frequent, so easy with me? Why was it so difficult for me to cry out, to scream like others when facing danger? How did I get to be this way? Could my life have been any different? Why was I so physically weak? Did I have to be strong to be treated with respect? Was my physical attraction a curse? I took more painful inner trips. I was sick with anemia, low blood pressure, palpitations, and cardiac arrhythmia. I frequently visited the doctor's office. All medical tests and examinations were negative. One doctor advised that I was not sick. This made me upset and depressed. Then my hair began to fall out mercilessly, leaving spots of baldness in the front and back of my head. Meanwhile, some interesting answers to the questions I had asked myself about my own behavior began to take shape. While revisiting my early childhood environments, city and village, I noticed two communities of generally responsible individuals and families. The adults of my childhood were not perfect, but they made taking their individual and collective responsibilities a highly valued prize. Being caring, giving, respectful, respectable, and sociable were strongly encouraged. Dignity, humility, and modesty were also high on the list of moral values. For the most part, not always, people were held to their words. As an oral tradition community, words were very important, i.e., those with the tendency to say things for the sake of saying them were not respected. This was a disincentive for me to lie deliberately, and an encouragement to believe that people meant what they said and said what they meant. In the village, there was only one notorious family of thieves and one accursed single man who did not bother to marry, but he specialized in taking married women from their husbands. Murder was a rarity. I only remember two. The first in the village was disguised as a hunting accident, and the other in the city was a murder attempt. One man made his bigger and taller victim drunk and tried to strangle him to death in the middle of the night. These two events were talked about for a very long time. 3 women had been caught together stealing a stem of plantains. Because stealing was strongly discouraged in our culture, they were automatically put in songs that were sung at weddings and First Communion celebrations everywhere in the area. One man was so greedy he walked around with a spoon in his bag, so no one would use lack of spoon as an excuse to not invite him to share their dinner. He too was put in songs. The songs would incriminate both the culprit and his or her clan. The culprits were despised both in and outside their clan. Children were so precious that when things did not work out between the parents, both mother and father, with the support of their respective families, would fight for custody for their children. Those who did not have any children were usually consoled with children of their relatives. One had to have a child. Most couples were married, traditionally, legally, and/or religiously. Male single parents who had not at least traditionally married, mainly due to severe poverty, had no reason to be proud of themselves because there might have been in-laws could claim and take away their children at any time. A marriage without the dowry, namely the bride price, a vika, comprised of gifts in kind and cash to the bride's family, was not considered a real marriage because marriage was between families, not just two individuals. All members of the groom's family contributed shares to the dowry. On the traditional wedding day, the bride's family, including all close and distant relatives, would have all the gifts, angada, ready for their daughter and sister. The more expensive and complete the angada, the greater the prestige and respect for the bride and her family in her in-laws' eyes. Such marriages were very hard to break. Most men, my father in particular, treated their wives with respect, and the wives lavishly returned the favor. Women sang the merits of their husbands at feasts. Because most people had embraced Christianity, there were few polygamous families. I remember two close neighbor polygamous families in the city. Each man took a second wife when all hope was lost for the first wife to ever bear a child. The first wife was part of the decision-making process. She often was also part of the selection process for wife number 2. The wedding for wife number 2 could only be done traditionally and legally because this practice was banned by the church. She was usually much younger than the first wife, yet the relationship between the wives was apparently cordial. The husband's nights were allocated to each wife in such a way as not to disrupt family equilibrium. Whenever anything contrary to this pattern happened, there would be no peace in the home. The church was always full to capacity on Sundays, and beyond capacity on holidays such as Christmas, Easter, Pascha, Ascension Day, Pentecost Day, among other major church holidays. Today, these things seem like fantasy. Yet, these were the realities of my early childhood environment. They shaped my thinking and my personality. Also accounting for my extreme naivete was the fact that my mother and grandmothers had been very protective of my siblings and me. I remember my paternal grandmother explaining to me why she, as well as my mother, had to shave my hair rather than braid it. I wanted to wear braids like many other girls in my age group. She said she was trying to protect me from being molested. Although I was not the only girl being shaved, other kids, especially boys, made fun of my shaven head, and they teased me by slapping my head from behind in the classroom. Whenever I turned to see who had slapped me, everybody was pretending to be busy reading. This was done most of my childhood until I went to live with Uncle Nakunu. My family's mistake was to try to protect me without teaching me how to protect myself. When my age of puberty struck, I was totally unprepared for the dangers ahead of me. For example, I was totally unaware of my good looks, simply because my constantly shaven head, my legs slightly bowed, and my complexion had been made fun of so much and so often that I became convinced of my utter ugliness. Uncle Nakunu and his wife had let my hair grow freely. A few months later, when people began to talk about my hair and good looks, I could not relate to it. It was as if they were talking about someone I did not know. On the physical side, I understood that part of my physical weakness was due to the fact that I did not eat the richer foods I needed to eat, such as various types of greens, all types of mushrooms, certain types of meat, the skin, feet, and head, and a variety of abundantly available vegetables. But I preferred junk foods, chocolate, candy, and the crust of staple foods, among other non-nutritious foodstuff. The adults in my childhood, especially my mother and grandmothers, tried everything to make me eat well, but it did not work, so they left me alone. Thank God my father gave me food supplements, but when I was in the village with my paternal grandmother, I did not take them. Consequently, I was frequently anemic. Also, I did not take enough fluids, namely, I was unable to finish a whole glass of water in one go. As a result, I was frequently dehydrated. On the Stoic side, two major events shaped my mind in a drastic way. I had tended to be a crybaby in my early childhood. I cried for the slightest frustration or discomfort. My parents and grandparents had too many of us to always attend to my bouts of crying, so my siblings and cousins decided to help me cry. They then took the habit of responding to my crying in unison. This made it sound like I was the lead singer and they were the chorus. This made me upset, and I'd cry more furiously. They too would pretend to cry just as furiously. Then they would burst out in laughter. The adults let them do this to me because they too were tired of my crying. One day I decided that they had had enough fun at my expense. I decided that I would not let anybody hear me cry again. Ever. I simply stopped crying. No matter how badly I felt like crying, I refused to cry anymore. The second event was a one-time occurrence in the village. I must have been 10 or 11 years old. One hot and sunny afternoon, I was standing at the southern end of my paternal aunt's front yard. There was a bush separating her husband's big house from their neighbor's kitchen house. All of a sudden, I saw the biggest and longest black snake, a comb, I had ever seen. It was crossing the small dirt road from the west side to the east side. I instantly began to scream in fear. My aunt's husband and other adults came running and asking what was the matter. I answered, pointing my finger toward the reptile, "A big snake!" To my dismay, my aunt's husband began to rebuke me, saying, this child, you are strange. How did you manage to see it?" No one ever mentioned this incident again. It was as if it had never happened. I gathered it was not a regular snake. Namely, it was a totem, and I, as an uninitiated, was not supposed to have seen it. Since that day, I never screamed again when facing danger. Could it be that I had become unconsciously afraid to be yelled at for bringing danger on myself? Whatever the case, I decided that this victimization syndrome was a consequence of the self-sustaining malicious system in which I was born, and I did not have to keep enduring it. Could things change? Yes, things could change for me. But how? I was a young, lone woman. It was not such a realistic idea to try to change the system. My thinking was that although I may not be able to change the system, something had to change. "I'll start with myself," I said. "This endless victimization has got to stop." My mind was made up.